All right. Good evening, everyone, and welcome. We have a great crowd in this evening. This is the second of our Fireside Talks for 2025. For those of you who don't know me already, my name is Nick Wright, and I'm the Ballycastle Museum Project Officer with Causeway Coast and Glens Ballycastle. This is now the fifth year that we've run a program of online talks during the winter. This year's program, Fireside Talks, is part of a much wider project to restore, extend and refurbish Ballycastle Museum with the support of National Lottery Heritage Fund. This current series showcases the amazing grassroots work that goes into recording and sharing our local heritage. All of our speakers are local historians or members of local community groups with a passion for the past, distant and not so distant. For many this evening's speaker, I think, needs no introduction. I suspect he'll be far more familiar to many of you than I am myself. Kevin McGowan is a tour de force, a member of the Friends of Ballycastle Museum, the volunteer group who assist in opening the museum each year. He's also a local historian and a tour guide, and publisher of a local heritage, or of numerous local heritage stories on social media, which are incredibly popular. This evening, Kevin will be speaking on Colliers Hall, now a popular guest house situated on the outskirts of Ballycastle. Throughout this illustrated talk, Kevin will explore the history of the house and its owners, tracing the connections to some of the other big houses of North Antrim, and taking us beyond the shores of Ireland to explore various international connections. The talk promises to uncover stories of plantation, landlordism, rebellion, entrepreneurial endeavour, and yes, like the title suggests, there's even a ghost. Over to you, Kevin.
Thank you, Nick. Right, because there's so many of you in, and I find it's all quite intimidating, I can't actually see your faces, so I'm not going to ask you to put your thumbs up. But can you hear me all right, Nick?
Yep, we can hear you, Kevin, and we can see your slides.
Right, fantastic, folks. Okay, so listen, we've got quite a lot to go through here tonight, so I'm just going to jump straight into this. And I suppose, first of all, Anna would kill me if I did say that actually Colliers Hall is not a guest house anymore, but the barn up around the side is still available for bookings on Airbnb and places like that there. So we'll just clarify that one bit. But tonight, listen, the title of this talk is then known as The Ghost of Colliers Hall. And if you can see then just in slide one there, you will probably see then Colliers Hall in its modern day setting. Just outside of that picture then, you're seeing on the left-hand side Colliers Hall, but just out of that then would be the Cushendall Road, or for those of you that maybe are not so familiar with this area, that would be known then as the Antrim Coast Road there. If you look then just to the right-hand side of that slide, you will see then that's just a clipping from one of the Ordnance Survey maps. I'm going to say the third edition of the Ordnance Survey, so probably late 1800s there. But you can see then that straight line then that is the Cushendall Road. But for us local to Ballycastle here, it's just known as up the Warren. But Colliers Hall is situated then probably about a mile outside Ballycastle, and it's situated then in what's known as the townland of Brockenlay there. Now, in that third edition map there, it's known as Brockenlay House. But in some of the first edition maps then dating to the early 1830s then, it was actually named as Colliers Hall, and it's really all that I've ever known it as, certainly in my time. It's intrinsically linked then to the Boyd family. It was most definitely one of the Boyd foundations, and the name really tells us all we need to know about it. The Colliers Hall is obviously related to the coal mines. And if you look to that slide there on the right-hand side, that Ordnance Survey map, you will see that there's three actual coal mines that's named then up in the top right-hand corner there. We have got the Bath Lodge mine, which is situated there beside Bath Lodge. Bath Lodge itself tied into the coal mine. It was probably where the men then, after a hard day's graft, came and washed themselves or took a bath or something along them lines. We have got the Salt Pans Colliery. And then over in the top right-hand corner then, we have got the White Mine Colliery now. Now, that name that we see there up in the top right-hand corner, that Port Watty, is quite an unusual name, and it's not one that many of us would be familiar with. We would know that today in 2025, and ever since I was a youth then, as McGuire Strand. And that was because the naming of that there was because then there was two Dublin men, two merchants at that time that came to Ballycastle under the guise of trying to claim a reward from the Dublin government, the Dublin sitting government at that time, to find a commercial enterprise, or I suppose to find a more cheaper alternative than the export of coal in from England. Now, most of the coal at that time was coming in from the Lake District of England, up and around Cumbria, Cockermouth, Workington, and places like that there. So them two brothers, the McGuire brothers, they were known as, they came to Ballycastle and they achieved their goal. They did now commercially work the White Star mine there. And still to this day, then we can see that their name is intrinsically linked to that particular area. But we can see then that Colliers Hall is just a couple of fields away with that. So what I'm going to try and prove over the course of the next couple of slides is that not only was it an agent's house there, but it was probably an administrative centre of some sort there, you know, for the coal mines that would have proliferated this area, stretching from the Palms Rocks that you're seeing on your slide right over then into that promontory of Fairhead there. But before we get there, I want to just talk about a few other things then now. And Anna will probably kill me for saying this, but Colliers Hall probably is not the biggest item of historical significance then in that townland then. But if you can see the map there now, can you see, Nick, can you see my mouse moving about there, no?
Yeah, we can. It's a bit patchy, so just move it a bit slowly, I'd say.
Okay, sorry. So if you see then all them blue dots that's visible then in that map there, so that's all places of historical significance there, just in that one townland there. But just directly opposite the gate then of Brochenley House there, as it's written on that map, or Colliers Hall, you can see then what's known as the Brochenley Cross. Now this is just situated just off the road on the verge of the grass line there, and is a really interesting piece of heritage here for us in Ballycastle. It's largely overlooked because it's people just drive by it, you know, as they head over towards the Glens of Antrim there now. We don't actually know too much about the cross. There is some real carvings, interesting carvings on it, and some people then would associate it with Coptic Christianity. Now I'd have to throw my hands up on here. I'm not a religious scholar of any shape or form, so I don't know too much about what that means. But the most common narrative then, I think, from local historians of a bygone age was that this was intrinsically linked then over to Machern Temple, or St. Fecra's Church here over in Machern Temple, which is now the Casements estate. Now, as I was preparing for this talk then, I always remembered Anna Hill then, the current inhabitor, the current owner of Colliers Hall there, talking about what's the word I'll find, remnants of something here, just in the bend of the river there. So in the first map then, 1832 then, that's actually marked out as a graveyard there. So is it possible or probable that instead of this cross making its way across the river from Machern Temple, the field of the temple, over to here, it could have came from this small graveyard just in behind it? It's probably something that we don't know, or will never know, you know. But Colliers Hall is obviously just sitting directly across the road from that there. Now, briefly then, just before I go on, where did this story come about? So I wrote a bit of a paper then many years ago that hasn't been published yet. It's quite comprehensive on the history of the Antrim Arms Hotel. And when I finished it, I moved across the road on to what is now known as the Tannery, but was the Royal Hotel. And in the 1911 census then, it was mentioned as being owned by the McMichael family there. And I'm sure there's quite a few McMichaels probably on this call tonight. I know there's two of the brothers there. I'll be speaking on some of the local history over the course of the next two lectures there. But the curiosity kind of got the better of me, and I was kind of wondering then who owned the hotel before them. And what turned out to be just general curiosity then turned into quite a comprehensive unpublished paper then on the history of the Royal Hotel then as well in Ballycastle, which, as I say, is unpublished. But in 1835 then, the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland came to the Glens of Antrim there. He was a member of the Liberal government of that time, the Whig administration, and he would have transversed or come across then what was the fairly new and probably incomplete Antrim Coast Road then. He stopped off obviously then with the Glenarm Castle there with the Earls of Antrim. He stopped off then with the Macaulay family in Cushendall, who play a little bit in our story here tonight. And then he came to Ballycastle and he stopped then at the Fullerton Hotel in Ballycastle, which is the Royal Hotel now, many years later. But it was noted in the broadsheets then of that time that none of the land gentlemen of this area, but specifically one name, Owl Alexander McNeill of Colliers Hall, never come out to greet him. Now, that would be kind of the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland probably wouldn't be as big a name today as it would have been in 1835. But I mean, you would expect it, particularly all them landed gentlemen and all the great and the good turning out to meet this man, but nobody did. And I kind of had to delve in then to find out why that was. And it was probably because most of these men were landowners, quite substantial landowners, land agents and that there. And the Whig government then was kind of a liberal government. So these men would all have been members or certainly associated in some way with the Tory party. I would imagine the modern day Tory party could do with some of that membership, to be quite honest with you. But if we move on then, folks, Alexander McNeill himself was mentioned. So that kind of put me then on the road of Colliers Hall and who this family was there. And if we look then to this next section here, this is Cathal Dallett's interpretation then of Ballycastle in 1760. And for those of you that's maybe coming in from afar then, Cathal Dallett, he was a local historian and the principal then of the Star of the Sea Secondary School, which is the modern day Shesburn House. Cathal was pretty much accurate there. You know, the Ballycastle that we now know today was very much laid out, and including many of the streetscapes is named then for members of the Boyd family. But we can see many of that Boyd industries, the remnants of them Boyd industries, still in situ in Ballycastle today. And just to give you a couple of examples there, if we look then down in towards the centre of that slide, we can see then the glassworks there. So we would still see the foundations of that conical structure. We have pictures in existence then of the manager's house, which you can see just down beside it. We would still call that Glass Island then in Ballycastle today. We can see the inner dock, which is the modern day tennis courts, and the bowling green here. Boyd's Pier there, it was funded then, or partially funded by the Dublin government, and it's still in situ there, but it's obviously been updated there, and it sits just at the back of the modern day marina. We've got the Customs House Inn, which is the current Marine Hotel in Ballycastle, and I think actually Jimmy McMichael will be talking a little bit about that next week, particularly the Custom House banner that's of King George III, and then we've got the Manor House in the corner and the brewery and so forth. If we move up the streets here, this is known then as the Lower Quay Road, and it's up into Ann Street. Ann Street was named then for Hugh Boyd's wife, who I'll be discussing in a little bit later on. But we've got the bleach works there, so we would still call that bleach green to this day. And then as we move in then to the Diamond area of Ballycastle, you will see the Boyd Church, where many members of the Boyd family is now buried. Okay, we also see then the Tannery, which is where this whole story started at, across the road there. It's actually the Royal Hotel there So a pretty accurate description then of Ballycastle in the 1760s. But our story actually starts then 2 years then after that map, or after that interpretation there of Ballycastle. So we have to ask ourselves what was happening then in 1762 in Ballycastle. And certainly through my research, I know there was two things of note was happening that is very relevant to our story tonight. Number one, Hugh Boyd's daughter would return to Ballycastle with her husband. And number two, then the McNeills, the people that were living in Colliers Hall at that time, who would become, or who were certainly the land agents for the Boyd estate, and would actually go on to become the receivers of the estate then in later years when the estate would move into Chancery. But we'll talk about that now shortly. But then McNeills then, that was living in Colliers Hall, they would change the spelling of their name from MacNeil, N-E-I-L-L, to McNeil, N-E-I-L-E. And we have to ask ourselves then, folks, why would they do this? So last year then, the Museum Service and Partners, they would put on a series of talks and investigations in this area. And his name's completely went out of my head, but a fella, Gray, then came up into the Ramon Parish Centre, and he was talking about the Boyds of Ballycastle and beyond. And while he was predominantly focused on the Boyd history, he did sway over into the McNeills. And he mentioned that Hugh Boyd's mother then was Rose McNeill from the Clare estate, which sits just above Ballycastle there. I know there's people on this call tonight that was involved in the investigation there alongside myself. But a commission then was, a dig was commissioned in the land of Murray and Quaig in the townland of Clare for what was known as this castle. And while it does look as if there was some kind of structure there, the findings that time were inconclusive. But I mean, if you want more information on that there, talk to Nick now, he was the leader of it. But anyway, the maternal line then of Hugh Boyd would come from Clare Castle. And on the death then of that line, that part of Ballycastle would be, that part of the estate then would be inherited by Hugh's brother, a man known as Alexander, and he would inherit the lands there. Now, Hugh Boyd then, he would spend time over in Cumbria, learning the trade and around them, the coal mines and that industry there. he would come back then and he would lease and then maintain much of this surrounding area of what we would now call the Ballycastle estate. But in 1762 then, Alexander Boyd of Clarecastle, he would pass away. Hugh himself, he would become an elderly man. He lived to be an elderly man considering the life expectancy of that particular time. But he would die himself then in the summer of 1765. So I think what we see here with the renaming of families and we see the daughters coming home is the preparation for the breakup of the Boyd's estate. And I say Boyd's are plural. So Hugh's daughter and husband then would return home from Donegal, and his land agent who was living in Colliers Hall would change that spelling of their name to the same as the maternal line of Hugh Boyd. And over the course of these next few slides, I'm going to try and explain where Colliers Hall came into this and give you the circumstantial evidence that will hopefully prove my theory, but it might not. But if we look to this slide here then, that is two wax miniatures then. That's of Jackson Ray of Donegal and then his wife Leonora. And Leonora was one of the Boyds. She was the daughter then of Hugh Boyd there. Now that couple got married in 1738, and I think it's entirely possible that these were wax miniatures that was made either as a gift or for that particular wedding. Now, Hugh himself supposedly had a number of daughters according to local literature here in Ballycastle, but I can actually only find any relevant information for two of these. One of them here was Leonora, and then the other was Margaret, who moved to Cushendall, but we'll come to Margaret. Charlotte Trench then, who wrote a family history, would come to Ballycastle in the 1930s, I think it was, and she only ever mentioned Hugh Boyd and four of the family. They were the sons Daniel and William, and the two daughters Margaret and Leonora now. So William, he would actually marry, but then he would predecease his father, and there was no natural heir to the estate then. The one that we would probably be more familiar with in Ballycastle here is often described then as being a lunatic, which probably meant that he was either incapacitated or he was unable to run the estate anyway. So as I say, it was later put into Chancery. And the receivers then of that estate would be the McNeils of Colliers Hall then. But Leonora there, I actually think she looks like, is it Princess Anne or one of them royal families people there in that picture? That's who she looks like to me anyway. But it's a French name in origin, and it would come into this Boyd family here through the Stuarts of Ballintoy now. The Reverend Archibald Stuart, he would marry a lady, and I am going to absolutely decimate the French for this, but Leonora Mouchon. And of course then Hugh Boyd's wife then, Anne McAllister, she actually came from Caoimhin Castle, which was situated in between the Boyd's estate and the Stuart estate there. So, you know, there would have been friends there. There would have been a close proximity or a close sort of social circle between them families. So that's where Leonora came from. Now, I would say that Leonora probably met Jackson Ray from Donegal in Coleraine there over at Jackson Hall. Hugh's sister then was actually married to Richard Jackson from Jackson Hall in Coleraine. And I would imagine that's where the Rays and the Boyds met then. But again, that's only my theory. Jackson himself, he was from County Donegal. And if you're familiar with Donegal at all, you will probably know the town of Ramilton up around the northwest there, the Ards Forest Park in the peninsula. Well, his family would own the lands up and around there, and they would also have some lands then just outside of Letterkenny as well. Now, we are successfully fit to trace the movements of this family through the birth of their children. And the first three children then were born in Ballycastle between the years of 1739 and 1745. And then the next three children were born then in Donegal. But the family, as I say, has moved back to Ballycastle in 1762. And we can see this then in land grants between the Earl of Antrim and Jackson Ray here at Ballycastle. He would inherit grounds as well of Hugh Boyd. Everybody inherited grounds of Hugh Boyd, but we'll come to that. He also would play a part in the Ballycastle Glassworks there, Jackson would as well. But for example, one of the payments that he made then to the Earl of Antrim was on the 16th of January 1762, where he paid the value of £1,800 sterling for a number of townlands right across this borough. But some of the ones that would be more familiar to us in Carey was Turnerone, Clegna, Prolosk and Craigalapin. And he was to have them to hold these for the natural lives of George III and Charlotte as Queen Consort and the said Jackson Ray there, you know. If we move on then, we can see then this is up in Lade Graveyard, and I wish I had probably a talk to Donald Alone there before I went on my search, but that's me and the kids there. And if you're familiar then with what Cemetery Sunday is here in Ireland, you'll probably be familiar that most of my kids must think that every Sunday is Cemetery Sunday, because I have them traipsing around a graveyard here in North Antrim somewhere. The Q's other daughter, Margaret, then she would marry into the Macaulay family of Glenville. She would marry Alexander Macaulay, who was a parliamentarian and quite a big name then at that particular time. But if you're down in Cushendall today and you look up there today, you'll probably see that white outline. It's quite a substantial building, you know, it's standoutish. But it would serve as a guest house, it would actually serve as a hotel, and for a period it was a convent as well, or a nunnery. Now, some of you then probably would know, well, actually, I know I can see there at the start, many of your faces are familiar to this area, so you will remember Frank Rogers. And Frank Rogers was a real inspiration to me here in local history. He was the chairperson for the Glens Antrim Historical Society. He was a member of the Friends Ballycastle Museum, and we sadly lost him there a few years ago, which is a massive loss to the Glens of Antrim. But Frank landed up onto my door one day here with this sort of leather folder and handed it to me, and he says, "You're the man for this, Kevin." But inside it then was like a leather-bound copy, and it was just a copy, but it was of Q Boyd's will, and there was a man's dissertation then about the coal mines and stuff in Ballycastle. I think it was dated to the 1950s, actually. But Q Boyd's will was an incredibly complex and comprehensive piece of legal documentation. All right, now he left money in the trust, he left lands for everybody, he left houses, as many as know there. There was the poor row, as we would call it, existed up to the 1950s, which is now the location of the Ballycastle Co-op. But that was built for some of the workers then of the coal mines that give the Boyds their money. Now, he left land immediately to Ballycastle to one of his grandsons, a man known as Alexander Boyd. But he would also leave land then to Margaret's son, a man known as Q Macaulay, but on the condition that he would take the Boyd surname. So therefore, he became then known as Q Macaulay Boyd. He became quite infamous then in later years for his journalism and political essayism. And I wrote a small Ballycastle biography for one of the local papers there some years back. You know, he was very, very good friends with Jonathan Swift. But one of the exceptions of the lands outside, and I'm going to read this verbatim, folks, here, but one of the exceptions to the lands outside Ballycastle was the dwelling house wherein Jackson Ray, Esquire, now lives together with the offices, houses, yards, and gardens, and a park containing about 6 acres now occupied therewith. No name is given to this dwelling house, but a deed executed then in November of 1766 refers to it again as having been bequeathed unto Leonora, the wife of Jackson Ray. Is this Colliers Hall? I certainly think it's Colliers Hall anyway. In 1766, Q Boyd himself, he would have been dead 1 year. As I say, he died in June of 1765. And this is really then where the McNeils entered the story. They seem to be living in Colliers Hall, these land agents and these receivers of much of the estate and around this particular time period. Now, that's an agent's definition from the Dictionary of Irish Phrase and Fable. And then just to the left of that, or sorry, to the right of that slide, you can see then, which is the McNeils of Kia banner there, okay? So in the top left-hand corner then, we can see, which is on the top and the bottom right-hand corner, is the silver lion and the blue background, which is heavily associated with the Lion of Scotland, or with Scotland in general there. Now, the top right-hand corner is the red hand of Ulster, signifying that it was Irish. It was up here in Ulster, but it's facing sideways, which is quite unusual. And I wonder, is that to signify that it was reaching across the sea here? And if I was to take those folks up around Fairhead there, and we were looking off the promontory of Fairhead there, right across there, you would see basically that's a pool of water out there, but it's surrounded by islands and land and all sides. It's just a puddle, really. And the Belfast deceased historian Jonathan Barden used to call that the Narrow Sea. So I'm wondering, is that red hand then signifying them reaching over to their kinsfolk there over in the island of Gea, Barra, and the Western Isles of Scotland? And, in below it then is the Salmon of Knowledge, which is obviously a very famous Irish story there surrounding Finn McCool. But then in the bottom left, we have got the red galley on the gold background. And this is known, you'll see this in much of the heraldry of Scotland there and much of the Western Isles, a really, really massively important story to the clans of the Western Isles and the Highlands of Storey. And that was effectively then the start of the story of Clan Donald. So when we think about the MacDonalds of Antrim and think of that really large strength of a family, this is where they started. But the story of the Galley of Lorne is when Somerled and his sons with their galleys managed to defeat a fleet of 80 longships then off the small island of Islay. And Islay is just 25 kilometres, folks, here beside Rathlin. You would see Islay on a very good day from here. But that was the start then of Clan Donald. But if we jump forward then a few centuries to a man then known as Alexander of the Isles, who was a bit of a naughty boy, and he rebelled against James I then of England and James VI of Scotland. But he was imprisoned then in Castle Swain then over in Argyll. And when he was released then, he would actually gain a greater importance. Now, there's a whole fascinating history there surrounding the Glens of Antrim and that man at that particular time, which is a whole other story. But he would become the Earl of Ross. And the story goes then that one of his constables when he was in that castle was a man known as Torquil MacNeill. And for his loyalty shown then to Alexander of the Isles that time, he was then bestowed then the island of Gea. And that is where them MacNeills of Colliers Hall and potentially them MacNeills of the Boyd's maternal line comes from. And how do I know this? So if we look then up to the left-hand side, by the way, my artwork's pretty shit here, to be quite honest with you. I wouldn't be that well technologically advanced, but I can tell a good story if it counts. But that monument then is erected to a Q Boyd, the son of the Reverend William Boyd, by Rose, the daughter and heir of Daniel MacNeill, late of Clare Castle. Okay, so that's deposited then in the Boyd Church here, just down in Ballycastle Diamond there. But if we look then to the carvings on that piece of marble there, we can see that is more or less the exact same crest as that one there. The only difference there is the top left-hand corner, okay, which probably signifies the Boyds of Ballycastle then, I would imagine there, okay. I've stole that slide there. I must apologise actually to that gentleman from Tyrone, Mr. Gray there, but I was sitting in the back of the room that day. He didn't know it, but I was on doing this work and behind the scenes, and that kind of just blew my head that wee bit there. So it was a welcome addition to this talk. But if we look then to the right hand side then of that picture there, you're seeing all that remains of the gateway then over to an ancient house in Losset over in Macrahanish there in Scotland. And it's dated to Lachlan MacNeill, and it's dated 1683. Now this Lachlan would actually pass away then in 1695. I'm actually members of MacNeill groups over in that particular area, so I've been tracing this up, you know. And the motto inscribed in the stone is Latin. Obviously, I'm not going to try and pronounce that there, but it means conquer or die. But the two crests then are very similar, with only that top left-hand quarter different really between the two of them. Now, Lachlan MacNeill, he would pass away in 1695, as I said, and had several children that emigrated then over here to the Glens of Antrim, and certainly to Antrim as a whole. But I would say, going by them dates, then that was in around the Battle of the Boynes, so that was probably with the Willamite armies at that particular time, or maybe even the Jacobite armies, I don't know. But one of them was a man known then as Neil. And Neil, he took lands in County Antrim, and he named one of his sons Lachlan. So we're seeing that name, Neil and Lachlan, coming down through that MacNeill family. It gets quite confusing, but it's going to get a hell of a lot more confusing before it starts to make sense, folks, so bear with me. But Lachlan MacNeill then, he would marry into the MacNaughtons of Binfarden. And I'm sure you are all familiar with Binfarden now, out there at Derry Keegan. The location of what was the safari park for many years. And if you go over, I think, in the Ballymoney Museum today, you'll probably see that there's an exhibition on that safari park happening there with the museum service. Or if you had been over that way, I think last weekend, there might even have been a snowdrop festival on it in Varden. But Lachlan, anyway, he married Jane McNaughton. And Jane McNaughton was the sister then of John McNaughton, who would be probably better known here by his other nickname known as Half-Hanged McNaughton. And for our American guests on this evening here, John McNaughton was infamously sentenced to hang for the murder of Sarah Jane Knox in Derry. But upon the rope snapping twice, he was then to be granted clemency, and he took it upon himself to re-erect the rope and hang himself, famously declaring that he would never be known forevermore as Half-Hanged McNaughton. You have to admire the man's dedication. Take my hat off to him. But Lachlan then, he would sell his interests over in Losset House in Scotland. He would actually sell them to his cousin, whose son would become a man known as Hector, which will come into our story just in a little bit. But he would move then and take up residency in Ireland here full time in the Glens of Antrim. He and Jane would move to Jane doesn't, sorry. I'm sorry, not Jane. What's Jane? Jimmy, no. Sorry. He and Jane would move to the townland of Ballycastle. And some of you will probably be aware then that Ballycastle is up the top of Kerry there, as we would say. And it's probably about a mile then as the crow flies from Brockenley and Colliers Hall. Now, you would imagine there with the background of the McNaughtons and the background of McNeil's that their place of residence would be quite a substantial building there, you know. And the only one up in that area that I can certainly think on then is Ben Van House, which, as we know, was owned by the Stewart family. And the Stewart family themselves had fled Scotland there for a very famous murder that was known as the Appin murder. Now, I don't know. The McDonalds then had that in later years grounds up there, so is it possible that that's where them McNeil's went to? There's lots of McNeil's up and around the top of Carry till this day. And there is a townland close to Ballycastle, which is known then as Big House, which might indicate I can't pronounce it, folks, indicate that there was a grander house in that locality at some point. The truth is, I don't know. But they didn't stay in Carry anyway. Lachlan and Jane would move then over into Cushendun, and they would start to take lands over there off the White family of Brochshane. We'll talk about the Whites later on too. But this was the start then of the Cushendun line of the McNeil's of Cushendun House and later Glamona House then. But Lachlan then, he had a brother who was known as Donald, and Donald seemed to be the ones that took up the residency here in Ballycastle and would start the Ballycastle line, or certainly the Colliers Hall branch of the McNeil's then. But we also need to remember at this point that there was McNeil's in this area already. There was Hugh Boyd's maternal line. So I think there's some kind of link there between them two. And the crest in Ramon Parish Church and that crest across the water of the Colliers Hall McNeil's, it's, you know, it's unequivocally linked to one another in some shape or form. And there is other circumstantial evidence to prove that as well. Now, that's just a horrible family tree that I managed to put together one night there to try and explain it, and it probably made it worse. I probably would have been best not explaining. But we can see then Donald McNeil and Margaret McLean. Now, that's not one of the McLeans from up and around Ballapatrick or up and around Glenmacieran. She was a Scottish woman there, came from a Scottish clan over in there. But Donald then, he would have Neil boy, probably making reference to his either ginger or yellow hair. It's a Gaelic word, but you would see that coming in there after some of their first names, which would obviously indicate maybe the colour of their hair or something similar like that. But he would marry then a lady, Jane Clark. And I haven't really traced the Clark family, but up until about 1855 then, most of the eastern side, the townlands on the eastern side then of the Knocklade, the mountain that sits above Ballycastle, was owned by a Clark family. And in fact, part of the Armoy, the small village Armoy, had been owned by the Clarks as well there. Some of them people are buried out there by the Round Tower and the Church of Ireland. I don't know if that's who Jane is. I'm saying just with the close proximity, the geography, probably the same sort of level of social activity is quite possible. But anyway, it's not really important to our story tonight. But they would have at least 3 children. And I have only ever really been able to find information to date on 3 of their children. One of them was the girl, she was known as Esther then, and she would go to the Western Isles. She would marry a Scottish lord there that would be in keeping then with that family history there. Daniel then, he would become a lieutenant major over in the East India Company. He was a real big player. And by 1814, he was the lieutenant general and was an honorary colonel of 2 regiments of native infantry and then one of the European infantry. And he became a really, really extremely wealthy man. And his house is actually still in Bath to this day here. It's one of Historic England's properties there. But Daniel McNeil, he never married. At one time, he collected diamonds to surround a locket, which reportedly contained the hair of the only woman that he ever loved. And after he died then, this was actually passed on then to Edmund McNeil of Craigdun, who gave it to his daughter-in-law, a Welsh woman known as Maud. And if we're over in Cushendun this weekend or over there today, you'll probably see Maud's cottages with the name still inscribed on them there, the old Coast Guard cottages in Cushendun. Now, the only son then, and the one that stayed in Colliers Hall, was a man known as Alexander McNeil, or Alec, as he became known. And that's him there looking at us front and centre. A real prominent character here, and probably one of the best known and wealthiest men then in the county of Antrim there. Now, if we look then to the left-hand side of that slide there, that is the pulpit down in the Boyd's Church there in the Church of Ireland. And we can see there at the bottom of that, it says, in loving memory of the very Reverend Hugh McNeil. So that was the son of Alexander. His name was actually Hugh Boyd McNeil. So there, take note of that name again, Hugh Boyd McNeil. You know, so there was more links there than we know. But that monument then to Rose McNeil sits more or less just to the left out of the picture there of that pulpit. That's indentures then down in the bottom right-hand corner. coming from Colliers Hall and the division of lands there, and they're dated to 1864 when that was kind of split 4 ways. And some of the grounds around that there now, the house itself did seem to stay within the Boyd family, and Ezekiel Davies Boyd had some sort of claim to that house then at a particular point. But a lot of this is incomplete, folks, and I'm still kind of working through this. It is incredibly complicated stuff. But Alec there himself, he was born in 1762, and his name was the Neale version, whereas his father's name was Neall. But Alexander, he would meet and marry a woman then known as Mary McNeil, a different pronunciation, Neale, of Culrusheskin there, just over by Dunseverick. And what the connection at this point between them McNeils in Dunseverick and the Neils here in Cushendun and Ballycastle at this point is, I don't know. I do know that they were cousins because in later years, Ronald McNeil, probably better known as Lord Crushingdown or Lord Cushendun, would confirm this. But then, after Alexander and Mary get married then in 1785, it is noted that Mary was the only daughter of John McNeil of Culrusheskin. Now, I have found a hell of a lot more information out since I found that little note there, and we'll be talking about Mary just in a minute there. But within 1 year of the marriage, as was the way in most of them landed families and other families too across Ireland at that time, they really started into having their kids. And a lot of their kids then, Mary and Alexander's kids, is actually buried in the nave of Bonamorgy there. A lot of them actually died in childbirth or was stillborn, and some of them lived to be a certain age, but they never survived. There was only 4 surviving members then of that family, who I'll talk about tonight. But John Q. Boyd, note the name as I say, Jane, and then Rose. By 1798 then, Alexander McNeil, the picture you're seeing there, he was acting as one of the local magistrates in this area. And in that year, Antrim rose in a rebellion, which is now known as the United Irishmen Rebellion. So being the local magistrate, he would play a real prominent part in this area. And Colliers Hall actually would become a makeshift prison for men or local men that were scooped up or lifted at that particular time there. But Alec, he was smart now. He would take his family from Colliers Hall. Apparently, he got word from one of his I'll not say servants, I don't really like that word, but one of his helpers. And he got word, and he took his family then from Colliers Hall, sent them over to the Gauges in Rathlin, and then from Rathlin, then they would head over onto the Mull of Kintyre to his cousin's house, Hector, who his uncle sold that estate to then in the Mull of Kintyre now. It was said that 25 of them McNeils from both here and Cushendun, and probably maybe Ballycastle up there, I don't know yet. There was a Dr. McNeil from Ballycastle too, went on this boat, who I know nothing about, by the way, at this minute in time. But they would take Q. Boyd's boat. Now, the sitting Q. Boyd at that time was married to a woman known as Amy Frisbee, and the boat itself was known as the Amy, so I would say that's who the boat was named for. They survived the rebellion, and then it was after this that local historians here in Ballycastle of the bygone age, they would say then that that branch of the McNeil family moved from Colliers Hall down into Ballycastle, somewhere near to Beechwood and close to the manor house. Apparently, all that was separating the manor house then from Alexander's house was an office, probably where this man was doing his land agency business then from there. Now, I don't know where that house is there, okay? I'm not saying that it is that house that you're seeing in the picture there. That's Shangarry House. All I'm saying there is that there's beechwood trees there, quite prominent still around this house today. If we looked out the front door of that house here today in 2025, you're looking up then what is known as Beechwood Avenue, which was laid out in 1928 then by a man known as John Huey. So there is some sort of link there to that particular area. And as I said then, a woman, Charlotte Trench, that was doing her family tree, she came up into Ballycastle and traced much of the Ray families. She met the Gages on Rathlin. She met Kathleen Boyd then, one of the last Boyd, I think, in Ballycastle. And she also came and met the Campbell family that was staying in this house in Shangarry here, who was fit to give her information and I think possibly pictures. So there is some kind of link there then to Shangarry House there and this whole story. I don't know exactly what it is now. Alexander then, in later years, he would become an extremely wealthy man. He was really, really well known in County Antrim, as was his son and as was his family. He would become a second captain in the Dunseverick Cavalry. And there was actually a brass belt buckle that was auctioned some years ago, and it said Dunseverick Cavalry on it. I can't pronounce that word, guys. But I wonder, is this maybe Alexander's badge? We don't know. But he would become the receiver of the Boyd estate, and he would take control of much of the legal matters in the town. And then in the years after he died, both this job and the land agency business that he had built up would actually transfer down then into his son-in-law, a man known as Alexander Miller, who married his daughter Jane. Now, just before we move on to the next slide there, on one occasion, just a few family notes here, a bit of rambling on my behalf, but on one occasion, Alexander and William McEldowney, McEldowney's of Clare Castle, or up the Clare at the top of the town there, it's now the Caravan Park, were seen walking together, and a passerby remarked, "There goes the grand jury." And then on another occasion, Dr. Young, who was from Kilgorm Castle over in Ballymena, he looked out of his office one day and he saw Alec and his son going by with a horse and carriage, and he remarked, "There goes the County Antrim in a gig." So these were really well known up in here. And if any of you wants to know more then about the 1798 period there, the trial records for Ballycastle and I presume other places is actually available there over in the Ballymoney Museum there. Extremely hard to read, so you might need a bit of artificial intelligence for that there. And then more contemporary times, you might have noticed then that in recent weeks, Donald Trump, we can't escape that name, can we? Changed the name then of Mount Denali over to Mount McKinley. And this was then for President McKinley, who had actually links to the Causeway Coast and Glens here and around the Derrykeegan area. His ancestors were hanged for their part in the 1798 rebellion. And we kind of tell that story then with some of the exhibits then just down in the Ballycastle Museum. Now, if you look across there, we're seeing another cutting from the Ordnance Survey map there. And that's given us then the town ran, or the place name there is known as Currysheskin. But historically, that would have been known then as Culrosheskin, which kind of translates from Gaelic then as behind the bog. And we can see then to the right-hand side of your screen there, that is Mary McNeil then, upright sitting on the chair. And that was the wife then of Alexander McNeil. Now, all I had to go on there from the family notes was the only daughter of John McNeil was Mary. And that black silhouette of her there in her later years. But that was only half the story there, you know. So I'm going to just talk briefly about this. But Mary was the daughter of John McNeil and his wife Rose. And Rose is actually now buried over in the Isle of Man. And the gravestone there in the Isle of Man, this was taken some years ago, actually specifically mentions the wife of John McNeil of Culrosheskin. Mary was only 2 years old when her mother died then in the Isle of Man. You know, on the Isle of Man there. And the story is that John tried to take the body back off the Isle of Man 3 times out of the corpse, but he wasn't successful, so therefore she was buried on there. And I think Old John McNeil, Mary's father, I think is actually buried then in Ballintoy Parish Church there. John, he took lands in Culrosheskin from the Earl of Antrim in the 1730s. And last year I went to a talk then in Ballintoy by Dr. William Rulston, who was talking in Ballintoy in the 18th century. And he used the parish vestry books to try and paint a picture of what was happening there in the 1700s. And I was kind of hoping that John McNeil was getting a mention, but he was mentioned continually in that area there. Now, Mary was not the only daughter. The McNeil family had several children, and they had another daughter known as Elizabeth. Elizabeth, she would marry a Portrush Belfast man then known as William Johnson, who would be wealthy in his own right. He would inherit much of the grounds there of Culrosheskin down in through his maternal line. But he also owned lands up there in East Belfast, which would include Newton Breda. Now, on marrying Elizabeth McNeil, he would give them as a wedding dowry the quarter land of Craigden, which is just down in there in Currysheskin. Now, if we were to go over by the White Park Bay into Dunseverick here tonight, you would see then the Bothy. It's a very popular destination, I think, for Sunday coffee there. I think it's got something possibly to do with the Asher family, then the Gaitern family here in the North Coast. But I think it's got some links to them. But if you look just down and below that there, down into the hollow, you would see a farm down in there. So that there was Craig Cottage down in there. And in April 1775, then we can see then that this wedding dowry that was given to these would play out across the local broadsheets, as William and Elizabeth, they wanted to sell. But John, the father, he wasn't having none of that there. And we can see retaliation in the broadsheets at this time. But anyway, regardless, the land did stay in the Johnston family up until the 1820s, when then it would change hands into the McNeils of Cushendun. But just to confuse things, folks, it was purchased with the McNeils of Ballycastle's money. Am I confusing you yet? Now, the land here would transfer from William and Elizabeth down into their son then, John Johnston. And John Johnston, he didn't want to stay here in the North Coast, and he didn't want to stay in Belfast. So he travelled then over to the Lisonore estate in Lochgill to Earl Macartney to receive letters of introduction for India. But Macartney talked him out of it, and he decided then to head to New York. once he got to New York, then he would fall in with local men here, established local men such as the Reverend Hills, people there from Ballycastle. I think Samuel Hill, a very prominent house and grave still there in New York yet. There was the Todds then from Collier, and I would say the Todds is probably out and around the outskirts of Ballycastle here too. I would say that's all the one and the same family. But they were all already established then in New York. But he didn't want to stay there, and he took a loan then from them men and went and bought some canoes then and made his way up into upper Michigan, and then lower Canada. And John Johnson himself, then, he would become one of the wealthiest and best known men in the state of Michigan in North America. He was the biggest fur trader in the state of Michigan, and he would marry then into the native tribes and have a number of children who I'm not going to try and pronounce their name, folks. But I've wrote papers on all the people that I'm talking about tonight, if anybody ever wants any more information. And it's all referenced and, it's done proper. But Jane, his daughter then, as she was called in English, is now recognised as the first ever Native American poet and writer that has ever been published. She took many of the Native American stories there and was the first then to translate them over into English because she was bilingual. Now, I think that's an incredible story for a small town just here on the Causeway Coast, and it's been largely forgotten. I never knew nothing about that, and I'm kind of, well, I'll blow my own trumpet a little bit here, but I'm kind of on the ball in certain areas of local history, and it's just incredible that we never knew that. But John anyway would later have to sell the land in Craig due to debt and bankruptcy after the American army, or the Americans, burnt his warehouse with £40,000 worth of pelts in at one time. So this was part of the American and the British wars now. But that's only a small part of a larger story there now. But Mary then, as I say, she would come to Ballycastle and she would marry then into Colliers Hall and would pass away then in 1852. And she's buried alongside her husband and some of her children then in Bonamorgie. Now, before we leave this slide, can you see over under the silhouette there of Mary? You will see then a bit of writing and a date just down beneath her legs there in the left-hand corner. So I wouldn't normally notice things like that, but this one stuck out to me, and I'm glad that I did. But it reads Edward, and the date is dated to 1838 there. So that was the year that her husband died. But Edward was one of the most famous silhouette artists of the 19th century. He was born in Dunkirk, and he left France, and I think he was running from the Napoleons. The Napoleons people, I think, was where he was trying to escape from them. But some of his sitters then would include the exiled French royal family of Charles X, and he would come then to North Antrim too, where he would spend time with the Campsay family of O'Harabrick over there in County Antrim. And then obviously the McNeils here would get their pictured on there too. Now, if you look through that window, I'm not going to spend much time on this, guys, because we've quite a bit to go through yet. But that certainly looks there like the rocks down and around in Severick there to me, if you look through that window. So I wonder, is that maybe in Craig Cottage? I don't know. That's just a guess there. I have no more information on that there. But I just thought that was a fascinating piece of local history here for us, you know. So that's John Johnson there, folks. He was a fur trapper, born in 1762, the same year as Oud Alec, and he died in 1828. And that's two then of his properties there up in the state of Michigan. They're historical houses today and are protected as such, and they tell the Johnson story then and the story of fur trading in general. Now, to my knowledge, he had only returned to Ireland once, and certainly to the North Coast once. The famous daughter Jane then would come to Ireland also, but she would stay down with her aunt then in County Offaly. And John would actually come here to go to England to try to seek compensation for his losses, but this was to no avail, and then he would have to sell the lands in Coolers. He sold them then on to John McNeil, then the son of Alexander McNeil in Ballycastle, but on behalf then of the land agent at that time, Edmund McNeil of Cushendun, in and around 1820 to the value of £3,220 there. Now that piece of ground over there actually stayed then into the early 1900s in the McNeil's family. The last owner of it was Lord Cushendun and Ronald McNeil, and I think it might have been given to him then as a wedding dowry as well, because he would take a tour of the land. It's written in the papers at that time that he would tour his estate there over in Cullier, and I think he actually spent time then in the Causeway Hotel there. But then after tenants' rights and stuff came in, then that land was being sold on then, you know. So that stayed in the McNeil family there for close to 200 years. That's just a slide down, folks, of Bonamorgie Friary there. That's quite an old slide there. The McDonald Chapel there, where the McDonald clan is largely buried in there. Just beneath it there, we have got the McNaughtons, another Scottish family. The secretary is then the Sorley Boy. And somewhere in that nave then is the McNeil burial. We do not know where the plot of the McNeils is in that there. In the 1930s there, an antiquarian, a Belfast man known as Francis Joseph Bigger, thought he was doing a justice by coming and tidying up many of these sites at his own expense. But what he did was he kind of, for aesthetic purposes, moved all them headstones then over to the sides, and it kind of tells us nothing, and we don't know where these things are now, in all these years later. Not that it's important, but it just would be nice to know. That's probably one of the oldest existing pictures there in Ballycastle, and that would have been taken there just down the road from Colliers Hall. And we can see then the thatched cottages there. Well, this was always known to me, and if Heather's on the night, I don't mean any harm in this. This was always known to us as Danny the Nags property. I don't know why. But we can see then you've got Bonamargie Friary down in there, the burial place of the McNeils. It wasn't extended at that point, so we can see the wall runs just across the gatehouse. And then just quickly, if we look down then into the shoreline there, you can see the manager's house of Glass Island. We can see where the customs house was there. We can see the manor house with the big chimney just on the corner here, and the Gages and Rackery House just directly in behind it. And there, folks, there, the Morgie Bridge, which is the start of the now world famous Antrim Coast Road, which takes us right through the Glens of Antrim there. We'll move on then quickly to the children then of Colliers Hall. So Alexander and Mary then had 4 surviving children, as I once said there. One of them then was John McNeil, and John inherited much of his uncle's fortune. Sorry, I was distracted there. There was somebody trying to enter the room. But he inherited much of his old uncle in Bath's fortune from that East India company there. But he would become an extremely wealthy man in his own right. And all I had to go on, all that the family paper said on this fella, I couldn't believe it, by the way, was that he was a successful South American businessman. All right, nothing more. Now, I searched and searched and searched South America, and I actually found a Spanish student's dissertation which went into great detail the history of this man and his connections then over and around Buenos Aires in Argentina and so forth. And this man here became a trader into them fledgling states over there. But he would become the main arms dealer to Argentina now. He was putting more arms into them fledgling states, as I say, than the British Army was at that particular time. And just to give you some context at that time, we need to remember that the Spanish Empire, which dominated there for about 300 years, was coming towards a close. The Napoleonic Wars that was dominating Europe at the same time was coming towards its finale. I'll not sing the ABBA song here tonight, but it was coming towards its finale, and there was a lot of weaponry and a lot of munitions there. So John, alongside Q Montgomery, again of Bunvarden House and various other names, then they started then trading into Argentina, and they were sending in salted meats. They were exporting tallow, quinine, cotton, and places like that there. And then after that, he would start supplying both the local military and the Royal Navy with arms. Now, he set up his own companies known as McNeil Dixon and Co. And just to give you an example, folks, of the kind of money that he was making at that particular time, was one payment to him in 1816 was for military supplies worth £33,564. And then because many of them small fledgling states and them militias hadn't the cash at hand, they would give mining rights, they would give preferential land strips and other forms of payments to the outside armourers. We can probably see this happening in 2025 there in Ukraine, as they're not fit to pay the American debt, so therefore they're looking some of their mineral rights there as a form of payment then in the modern day. So 200 years later, nothing much has changed really, has it? But John McNeil then, he would have silver mines in the regions, and he would form alliances with men such as Jose San de Martin, who's Argentina's national hero, and he would also then become friendly with one of the founder of the national banks then in Argentina. And I think that's probably played a role then in his part when he returned down here to Ireland, because when he came back, he was one of the founders of the Northern Bank. And if you can see that note in front of you, you can see probably the names there: James Orr, John McCance, Hugh Montgomery, again, Bunvarden connections there. And then just down at the bottom of it, and John McNeil. So that's John McNeil there, just up in the top right-hand corner there. But last year then seen the 200th anniversary of the Northern Bank, and John McNeil, he was one of them original founders. He would still make money from his American ventures, but he would move them from Ballycastle at that time and he would move up into this large house then, which is known as it's known as way off my notes here. It's known as Rosemount. No, not Rosemount. Bear with me. I've got a note here somewhere. Parkmount. It's no longer there in Belfast now. The only place or the only recognition of that in Belfast today is known as Parkmount Road there. But one of the actual carriages then of the old Northern County Railways was named Parkmount again then in commemoration for him, because not only did he found the Northern Bank here, but in March of 1844, he, alongside the Davisons then of Brockshane, would be one of the proposers for the Belfast to Ballymena Railway. And what we have to understand, folks, was that Ballymena, through that period, was one of the largest linen producers. You know, that's what Ballymena was. And it was probably one of the largest inland market towns there, with very little access to it. It wasn't like Scotland where they had canals, or down around Newry where canals was. So it was in these men's best interests then to fund these railways into these places that before had been very hard to get to. So he became then a director, and he was actually known then as a nickname as the father of the old Northern Counties Railway then, you know, a really important man. And his personal life, he married twice, but one of the people that he did marry then was obviously a Spanish woman, Donna Pascuilas, but she came with a fortune of $400,000. So we can see there happening in North America was the exact same then as what was happening in South America with his cousin then, John Johnson. This was a form of colonialization, was they were marrying into the local tribes at that particular time, and they were gaining favours and gaining grounds from them there. He would get married a second time then on June 14th, 1823 to then Charlotte Lavinia. And there's a fantastic story around that there that I don't have time for tonight, guys. He had a number of children there. Henry Hugh McNeill, he would inherit much of the fortune, and he was an old soldier then. He was fighting over in the Korean War at one particular point, but he was the founder of the Larne to Kinryan stream packet. And then, obviously, to get people out as far as Larne, then he was one of the main funders and proposers then behind the Belfast to Larne train line. And that association with trains right through from 1844 is something you can see coming right down through this family line up until even the Ballycastle station here in the 1880s. All right. His daughter then, he only had the one daughter, and she was known as Mary Harriet Cairns McNeill, and a really important woman too. But she would marry then Hugh McCalmont Cairns, who was twice the Lord Chancellor then under Benjamin Disraeli's government. And the city then of Cairns in Australia is named after his brother. That house that we see there down the bottom, that was actually the Cairns' home place. They would move then to the other side of Belfast Lough, and John McNeill would take on Parkmount there. Now, if we look to the top right-hand corner, you will see then what is known, that ship there, it's known as the Lady Cairns, and that's actually mentioned in probably Ireland's most famous book, or certainly one of them, James Joyce's Ulysses there, the sinking of it in Dublin Bay. Now, there's a sad story in around it, but it still lies in Dublin Bay to this day, and it was named then after Mary Cairns there, the daughter, Mary Harriet, then the daughter of a Ballycastle man. And then finally, before we move on then, folks, that there is the modern day strip in East Belfast of the Glentoran football team. And AJ McNeill, another son then, he was injured hunting quite early in life, and he founded his own cricket club, which had the colours there, the green, black and red, and that was what the Glentoran used then as inspiration for their kit. Now, if we move on then, we can see then Q Boyd McNeill, 1795-1879, and I know there is some Liverpool people on the call here tonight, so they would be familiar with this man, and statues then erected to him then down in Liverpool there. But a really interesting character, again, note the name Q Boyd there, but he would be known in around Ballycastle then as Black Q. He was very, very rabidly anti-Catholic, and he actually wanted then the death penalty for people who were receiving communion there. You can see that again in the broadsheets at the time. This isn't me just showing any sort of bias here. I'm just writing the story as I can see it now. Now, he was going to follow a career in law, and his old uncle over in Bath and wanted he give him special privileges and really wanted to give his money to him. But he wanted him to follow a career in politics, namely with the Conservative Party or the Tory Party then at that particular time. Now, Q Boyd didn't do that, and that's why then that other brother, John, managed to inherit much then of the uncle's fortune there, in general. Now, he took the Grand Tour alongside his uncle. And for those of you then that don't know what the Grand Tour is, it was a European trip then around most of the major cities there in Europe. And it was really extremely popular, and well-off young men and it was really a coming of age in them. But once he took the grand tour there, he was spending time, and the family notes then of the McNeils would write about this. He would stay with the likes of Lord Byron, quite a famous name there from history, Madame de Stael, who was probably one of the main protagonists then against Napoleon. I don't know if I used the right word, protagonist there, but she was very fundamentally against Napoleon, and I think had to seek refuge then in some of them. But he would also spend time then around with Mary Shelley, who famously wrote then the novel Frankenstein. But he took really, really ill then over in Switzerland that there, and he was very, very close to death when a man then known as Henry Brougham came in. And I don't know what Henry did, but Henry managed to save his life. And Henry Brougham himself, there's a street in Belfast named after him, just there at the front of Yorkgate. And he was the inventor of the Brougham car, cart, and you would see in the back horses. But he was also responsible for this founding of the city of Cannes over in France. But from that point then, when his life was saved then, he followed his faith devoutly, and he become probably one of the most well-known preachers of the Victorian era there. He moved into Liverpool, and if we look to the bottom of the slide there, you can see that church was built for his parishioners, a value of somewhere between 11 and 12,000 pound, and that's his statue then down in St Paul's, I think it is in Liverpool. I think it's St Paul's. But in 1830, in the 1830s, as I said at the start of this, there was a Whig government, a Whig administration then came in, and they managed to push through the Reform Act, which included reform of the education system. So what we were seeing then is national schools then pop up all around Ireland and around England. That you would still see many of these schools, and I think, in fact, some of the people on this call tonight might have actually lived up in the national schoolhouses there in Ballycastle and in Ballycastle. Ballycastle is no longer with us. The two of them has been demolished. But effectively, it was a non-denominational curriculum, which meant taking the Bible out of the education. And this man here, as you can imagine then, Black Hugh as we call him, was at the forefront of the opposition to this. So he would actually start building his own schools then in Liverpool, Bible schools. And they were extremely popular. And what we have to understand then about Liverpool is it was predominantly an Irish Catholic city. For him to actually still manage to continue to get people to go to his schools as opposed to the national schools was quite a big feat. He actually managed to succeed in swinging control of the Liverpool Corporation away from the Whigs into his own hands there. So a really important character there. Now, we'll finish up on him there, okay? But if we look down into that slide there just below Bonamargie, you can see the Abbey, you can see Donaneely Fort, and then you can see what's labelled there, the Ice House and the Schoolhouse. So that's still there. It's an air bed and breakfast now. I think it's an air bed and breakfast, but that's owned, I think, by the McKimbridge family. I'm not too sure who owns that. But that's just up above Drumhammond Bridge there. And that was a school there. That was a non-denominational school there. And that was built by Hugh Boyd. And we can see it there in the Ordnance Survey. And in July of 1835, then Drumhammond had 6 Protestants, 18 Roman Catholics, 18 males and 6 females. And the school's proper name was actually known as the London Hibernian Society for Establishing Schools and Circulating the Holy Orders, the Holy Scriptures in Ireland. So quite a substantial character here on the North Coast, even yet. They died in Bournemouth then, I think, in 1879. My slides isn't going forward here, folks. That's us now. He himself had a number of children as well. I'm just going to kind of rush through this because I'm obviously conscious of the time tonight. But the most famously remembered one there, as you can see, most of them actually either drowned, was blinded, or was accident and killed in accident. So for all his faith, he wasn't really very fortunate, was he, to be honest with you? But the most famously one reminded here then, or remembered in the Glens of Antrim, would be that guy then, John McNeil down in the bottom. You can see a picture of his grave there, which is up in St James's here in Ballycastle. And he would drown then in the 30th of September 1898, then just in the Vanishing Lake there. And successive generations then of school children still listen to the ghost story of the Colonel McNeil coming to get them. It's still a spooky place just even there yet. So we're moving on then to the ladies of the family. And this is Rose McNeil then. She was the eldest daughter of Alec and Mary. And a really interesting character now. Her uncle over again in Bath, she was a favourite of his, and he had her over there for a period in England. And if you look to the bottom right-hand corner there, this is where Rose could have been living at if she had have behaved herself and married who her uncle wanted her to marry. But she was a strong, independent-willed woman, and she decided then to marry who she wanted to marry. So she married then her first cousin then, a man known as Edmund Alexander then of Cushendall House then over in Cushendun then, and they get married on the 13th of May 1817. Now, she was a sickly woman, was Rose. And if you're looking at that picture over there, just up in the middle of the screen, she doesn't look as if she's doing too badly. She's certainly thriving, and she lived to be quite an elderly woman. But I would imagine that's probably a picture of, or the oldest picture, or the oldest, I don't know how I'm getting the words out here, but that's probably a picture of the oldest woman we've ever seen in Ballycastle there, that one there. I think so, anyway. It's a fascinating story there. But anyway, she moved anyway to, or her and Edmund Alexander, she was sickly, and they decided they were going to go for him, but they only ever got as far as Jersey Island. And the family there would take up there, and they would live there for the next 30 years or more. She would have a number of children out there, and there is actually still structures then on the island of Jersey to this day associated with the McNeils. So if you look to the top right-hand corner then of your slide there, that house then is known as Chamor, which means big house in Irish, and that was built then by Alexander McNeil, Edmund Alexander, and Rose there, and they would have a number of children in that there. In later years, that was given to Bernardo's Boys Home for peanuts, very, very little money at that time. And as was Boyd's house in Ballycastle, coincidentally. But anyway, after Rose died then, she died, and Edmund Alexander then, he moved back to Ballycastle. He died then in 1879 and is buried then up in Lade Graveyard there, just above Cushendall. Some of their kids then was Edmund McNeil, who had been Long Eddie, was known as Edmund Moore, or Big Eddie in the ground. And all these McNeils, including Edmund Moore, Big Edmund McNeil, Lord Cushendun, Daniel Alexander there, Captain, extremely tall men, like standoutish tall men there, okay? But Edmund then, he would marry then his first cousin again, which is kind of a trait we're seeing here in the family. And if you ever hear then that old sort of antidote that money goes to money, well, this is where it's coming from. The bloodline was getting thin, but the money was being kept within the family. We'll come to Mary Miller then, but they would have two daughters then, and then one son. The son was probably one of the best remembered then of the McNeil family and Cushendun. That was Ronald John there. Now, Edmund and Mary, they lived for a period then over here in Cushendun House. We can see just down in the bottom right-hand corner of that slide. And they would move then, they would actually build Craigdun House then, or Craigdun Castle in Culfeightrin, which I'm going to come to here very, very shortly. But up in the top right-hand corner, or top left-hand corner, sorry, is Glendun Lodge, where Miss Ada, probably the best known of the McNeils, as I say, in the Glens of Antrim, probably the most fondly remembered, certainly. She lived there in Glendun Lodge, and she finished out her days there. But her father then was Daniel Alexander. Again, he's buried up in the graveyard there. Now, Elizabeth McNeil, she would marry a man known as Adolphus Turner, and that's Gurry Lodge there, just in the bottom left of that there. This is where Elizabeth McNeil would marry. It's still on Jersey Island to this day. As you can see, it's quite a swanky pad, if I can put it in such terms. But they were the governors, actually, of Jersey Island. So them Turners was quite a substantial family in the history of Jersey Island. And in fact, Elizabeth McNeil's father-in-law brought back the Rosetta Stone then from Egypt. And I wrote the Bermuda Stone there, but it's actually supposed to read the Rosetta Stone. And for those of you maybe that's unaware of what the Rosetta Stone was, it's only because of that Rosetta Stone that we're really fit to decipher Egyptian hieroglyphs then to this day. So just to have a connection to that, to Ballycastle and the North Coast there, I know it's about a colonial appropriation, but I just think it's a fascinating link. And then Charlotte Lavinia, the youngest daughter, then she married up into the right-hand corner there, the first lord of the Admiralty. So they were all marrying well, these people. Jane McNeil then, she stayed in Ballycastle. Old Alex's youngest daughter, she would marry this man here over in the right-hand corner, a man known as Alexander Miller, who came from Dungannon, and he would actually become then the treasurer of County Antrim for over 20 years. He's buried up in Culfeightrin there, up at the Church of Ireland, just at the back there, in quite a substantial grave, But he would probably have been responsible, or he certainly would have something to do with the funding of the Antrim Coast Road there. Donald alone now, who's on the call tonight, would probably be more of an expert in that area anyway. But up to the top left-hand corner, so that would have been the Miller House then, as we would have called it, and the walled garden there in the 1950s, or certainly in the years before it. And then over on the right-hand side there, that's its current state. It's actually in a worse state today because that big storm that came in there in January, it took much of the roof off it. It took this big chimney down as well there, So really an interesting place. Now, the Millers there, they would actually move down to the Lower Key Road then, just up the road from her father there. And we would still, or some of us certainly in Ballycastle, would still call that then as Miller's Yard then to this day. It's now the home then of Michael McGowan family. They're down at Fragrance there, just down in the Lower Key Road. But up around the top of Ballycastle, well, the Millers there, that house is that Whitehall there. Many of the various cul-de-sacs, Whitehall Garden, Whitehall Drive, Whitehall Crescent, etc. That obviously comes from the Miller family there, you know. Really, really interesting. And arguably, it would be their children that would go on to do much better in life than many of the rest of them. So you're seeing then here, folks, in the bottom left is Macharran Temple, the home then of the Caoimhin family right to this day. And it would be Charlotte Miller then who married John Caoimhin of Macharran Temple. And they would actually take a house down here on this location, and they would build then this Scottish Baroque type building here in 1873. Now, for many of us, it's probably better known then for the childhood residence of Roger Caoimhin, then, who was hanged in 1916 there. If we look then up to the top left-hand corner, we have got what's known then as Craig Dunn Castle and What Castle, and that was built then by Mary and Edmund McNeill of Cushendun House. Now, they used Cushendun House as kind of like a seaside resort, but this would have been their main place of residences. And after Edmund returned from Australia, again, another story that I don't have time to go into tonight, he came back here and he took over much of the land agency business then of his father-in-law, Alexander Miller, who took it off his father-in-law, who was Alexander of Colliers Hall. But they would build, so you can tell much of the wealth there. And at this time then, what he was doing was he was moving much of his land agency business here from the inaccessible north coast down to that central location there, just back outside Collier, or outside of Ballymena, sorry. And as I say then, most of them were involved in the trains then that was starting to run at that time too. So North Antrim certainly was opening up at that particular time. Now, if we look over to the top right-hand corner, Rose Miller, she would marry then John Young of Kilgorm Castle. And John, he was quite a prominent figure then in Ulster Unionist politics, certainly towards the end of the 1800s and the early 1900s. And he was one of the 6 signatories of the Ulster Proclamation of 1913. And I think there's a picture of him, quite a famous picture of him and Edward Carson standing here at the doorway of Kilgorm Castle now. As of yet, I've never been fit to find a picture then of Rose Miller, unfortunately. So, as we all know then, women are largely written out of history. Just quickly then, that's the only son then of the Miller family there. He's sitting in the centre there beside George White then of Brochshane. George White, he's wearing this white suit. And that's then. But these men became really powerful men then over in India and then through the British Raj then at that time. So as you can see there, that's a slide. And they were known, this small group, 6 men, that was the men that ruled India there, you know, some more colonialisation there, you know, and then the bottom one then is actually Alexander Miller's son, who died in later years. But there's a really interesting story here that I'll just touch on at the very end there. But, like, you know, these were strong families, really powerful families with a strong identity then of Ulster Unionism, you know, and really wanted to keep their power there. But we can see this branch here, certainly, their younger children and stuff coming to the fore then over the course of the next few years. And we see names there like Jack White then, the son of George White then, who would become one of the founders of the Irish Citizens Army in Dublin in the years before the Easter Rising. We can also see Roger Caoimhin there coming to the light. We can see Ada McNeill, we can see Jack White, Rose Young, Margaret Dobbs. Now, these were all very much the black sheep of their family, but these people were all related through marriage and different things. So it was like a wee bohemian group here in the Glens of Antrim that was kind of going down the road of Irish nationalism and Irish revival then at the start of the 20th century. So we can see then Ronald John McNeill, and that was his second home then. This was Glenmona House, which was burnt down in the 1920s by the IRA. But he would probably be one of the best remembered of the McNeills in Cushendun, and would be responsible for building much of the Cushendun then that we now know today. That's him and his wife then sitting just at Glenmona. He's buried then down in Cushendun Old Church. And coincidentally then, I think we actually have Dr. Margaret Ward on tonight, who will be launching a book in this church now. I think it's on the 1st of March. It's coming up anyway, but it's about Coonan the Ban then, and the female wing of the IRA in both Glens and Belfast then, you know. So It'll be tied in there, but it's a lovely location. He's probably more famously remembered, certainly in the Glens of Antrim here in some quarters, as the man that famously threw the book at Winston Churchill across the Houses of Parliament there, hitting Churchill in the face, and this was around the Home Rule debates. So Ronald John McNeill there, who would become Lord Cushendun, or in the Glens he was known as Lord Cushendown, but he was staunch in his unionism and really didn't want to see that Home Rule then coming to Ireland, so he was quite staunch. And I suppose then for those of you on the call tonight that's from the Glens Antrim, you'll probably know that Churchill himself then, he would own substantial lands here in the Glens Antrim and around Carnlough, up around Garntar as well. But Ronald, he died in 1934 and he's buried then at Cushendun Old Church. And if we move on then, we can see Ada McNeill then, his cousin, who, as I say, is probably one of the most fondest remembered women in the Glens there. I actually do an International Women's Day most 8th of March, I think it is, usually. I haven't been approached this year just for it yet now, but we would always stop then at the grave of Miss Ada, as she's fondly remembered in the Glen. But she was the only daughter then of Daniel McNeill, and she's remembered for her part in the Irish revival of that time, the Glens Fish and the Irish nationalist movements at the time now. She grew to be a really elderly woman, and I think that picture in the middle there, this might be the first public showing of that picture there. I don't actually know. That was taken, I think, by one of the Richmond sisters, who I'll talk about just in a minute or two. And Ada died then in 1959, and she's buried then in Cushendun Old Church as well there. There's a remarkable difference between her grave and her cousin's grave, Lord Cushendun. Now, we're nearly finished, folks, okay? But that there is a poem that I'm not going to read out just due to time constraints tonight there, that was written then by Edmund Alexander McNeill, who had died then in 1879. And we started this story tonight there calling The Ghosts of Colliers Hall. Now, if you look over to the right-hand side there in that doorway, you can see the figure in white of a man then. Okay. And Miss Ada, or Ada McNeill, on seeing this picture, she said that that figure seen standing at the door in white was the unmistakable figure of her grandfather, who had been dead for many years. So that, my friends, is one of the ghosts of Colliers Hall. All right. That's the remnants then of Cushendun House. Cushendun House is no longer there. I think there's actually a lovely house built on the grounds of it there, but it's just at the foot of the corkscrew really there as you get into Cushendun, just above the hurling pitch now. And it wasn't, unlike Glenmona House in later years, it wasn't maliciously burnt down. I actually just think it was a tragic accident. But to take us back then to Colliers Hall then, in later years in 1864, as I say, that their land seemed to be split up into 4 different factions there, which would include the McNeils, which would include the Casements, the Boyds, as I say, kept some links to that hall, to that house as well then at some point. Now that there is a picture of the Casement family then standing to the left there, and them cobblestones then just to the left of that doorway, that's the unmistakable front door then of Colliers Hall there, that I'm sure many of us is familiar with then. If we look to the right of the picture then, this is Hugh McCarry, and I'm sure some of his descendants is on the call here tonight, and some of his children. But he would then, at the end of the 1800s, the start of the 1900s, then he would purchase then Colliers Hall. And for a house that started off with such a strong unionist, conservative identity, it certainly moved into the 20th century. It would be something completely different. And throughout the early years of the 1910s to the 1920s, then Colliers Hall would have been associated with both Cumin na Ban. It would have been associated with Uglin Air and the 3rd Northern Division and such places like that there. The great stories there. I'm sure if you read Margaret Ward's new book, the one that's been announced there, you'll be paying me, Margaret, before this is over the night. But you'll see some of them stories then in that book then in this particular area there, Folks, we will get finished up here, and I would just like to dedicate then this lecture, or this talk, I should say then, to the memory then of Jordan McCarry then of Colliers Hall, who sadly passed away then in 2023 then. I had many a drink then between Hunter's Bar and the Harbour Bar in Ballycastle there, an absolute gentleman, and a really fond memories of a man to talk to then at the bar there. And then a special word of thanks to Susan and Elizabeth Richmond, who had done an extensive family tree. And when I say family tree, just the dates. It was myself who went in and did a lot of the research, but that is available down in Ballycastle Library. It's an extensive document. It's about maybe a metre wide by about 2 foot high, and it tells you a lot about them McNeils there. And just to finish it off then, I've managed to trace it back in through the Scottish line there, and I think that is going to be our next talk, but not the night, folks. All right, so thank you very, very much for your time then the night. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kevin, for that really fascinating talk. You started there talking about Jonathan Gray and his talk on the Boyd family that we had there in Ramoan Parish Centre back in autumn. On behalf of the museum service, it's really wonderful to see, I guess, these different talks talking to each other. You know, your talk is very much a legacy of what's gone before there. And drawing those connections then between Jonathan's talk on the Boyds and your own work on the McNeils really, I think, strengthens the work of both of them, and in helping us sort of understanding these big house families that really were influential in the earlier part of the development of Ballycastle. I've got there in the chat, for those who are interested, I popped a link to Jonathan's talk as well. I'd encourage you to go back and have a look at that at your leisure. The other observation that I'd add before opening the room up to any questions is that you really don't need to scratch the surface, do you? Before you see the connections between the sort of north part of North Antrim and the rest of the world, and how events that happen around the world really impact on some of the stories of the families here. But no, fascinating. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah, it's only one part, as I say, of a much larger story. If any of this is actually looking, I've got papers, and everyone, most of them characters, like even down to the females and stuff there, that's over in Jersey Island and stuff, you know, and I have them all referenced, and they're all sitting in the house here, so you're more than welcome if anybody needs that information there. I finished then on the last slide there. It was the Ugadale lawsuit, which is a part of Macrohannis there, where I'm going over actually to visit now later on this year in the Mulligan. But this family descends from that particular area. And in 1820, there was somebody came to Christendom House, and this man would have been the owner for these lands then in Macrohannis, which just would have multiplied his landownings here in North Antrim. And it all came back then to what was known as a green Scottish bag. And that green Scottish bag was kept in a house in Ballycastle, all right? And I would dare say that that was kept in Colliers Hall. Now, I can only say that through circumstantial evidence, but I think then that green bag would have held the rights to them ancient lands in the Mulligan. But when they got to Ballycastle, it was heavily invested with parasites and whatnot. So there you go. That's the McNeils.
Thank you. Kevin, are there any other questions in the room there?
Just thank you very much, Kevin. I've never met you, but we've corresponded now and again. And your knowledge just is spectacular. It's wonderful. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Patricia. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Kevin. I enjoyed that very much.
No, thank you.
Very, very detailed.
I didn't know too much, and I was hoping that.
Well, you know.
No, it was lovely.
And interesting people.
Yeah.
It was brilliant. Thank you very much, Kevin. I'd love to have another talk on the black sheep.
Is that Margaret?
Yes, it is. Yeah, it is. Very tantalising. Great people that you are referring to.
I'll be looking both my commission from the hills of Colliers Hall and both yourself and Margaret at our next meeting.
I hope we meet up. Yeah, on the 1st. Yeah, that would be great.
Certainly.
Thank you, Kevin. A great talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Kevin. We're watching here in Colliers Hall night ourselves. We're going to keep the lights on, make sure there's no ghosts.
Don't worry.
I'm still reeling, Kevin. so much to absorb.
Hopefully that never bumbled. Yeah. That's me done talking for me, I think.
Kevin, you've got multiple thanks and notes of appreciation there in the chat, so have a look at that. There's a gourmet nugget, lots of thank you, Kevins, lots of fascinating talks. So I have a look at that. But folks, thank you very much. I'm aware that it's getting on in the evening. So from us, thank you very much. Next week, we're joined by James McMichael. He's speaking on the topic of Alexander MacDonald, an 18th century stonecutter. whose work can be found across Ballycastle and the wider area. So until then, thank you again, and I hope to see you then. Thanks very much.
Bye-bye now, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.